The beggar at the palace gate was the missing crown prince of Ife. The guards dragged him by the collar of his rags through the dust, and the crowd at the palace gate of Ife screamed for his blood, because no one was supposed to touch the ground where the new king would be crowned. But what nobody in that crowd knew, what not even the guards beating him knew, was that the beggar bleeding in the dirt was the true crown prince of Ife, stolen from his own cradle 20 years ago and left for dead by the very men now cheering his humiliation. Stay with me till the end, because what happens after this beating is the kind of secret this kingdom buried in blood. And if stories like this move something in you, tap that subscribe button now, because you don't want to miss where this one goes. His name, the only name he had ever known, was Kayode. He did not know he had another. He did not know that somewhere beneath the rags on his chest was a birthmark shaped like a leopard's paw, the mark of the royal bloodline of Ife, hidden under years of dirt and scars from sleeping in gutters. He only knew hunger. He only knew that the palace gates smelled of roasted goat meat that morning because the whole kingdom was preparing for the coronation of Prince Kunle, and beggars were not permitted within 100 paces of the palace walls on a day like this. He hadn't meant to come so close. Hunger makes fools of careful men, and Kayode had not eaten in 3 days. He had followed the smell of meat like a dog follows its nose, forgetting himself, forgetting the unspoken law that beggars belonged to the market square and the riverbank, never to the palace road, paved with white stones reserved for nobles and priests. By the time he remembered where he was, 2 guards already had him by the arms. "Filth," one of them spat. "You dare defile the coronation road with your stench." Kayode did not fight them. He never fought. Fighting back only made beatings longer, and he had learnt that lesson with his body more times than he could count. He let them throw him down, let the dust fill his mouth, let the crowd, dressed in asolke and coral beads, waiting for their new king, laugh at the sight of a starving man groveling in front of the gate he wasn't fit to look upon. But one woman in that crowd did not laugh. She was old, wrapped in a faded blue iro that was once indigo before the years bled the color out of it, and she stood apart from the others, near the baobab tree that marked the edge of the royal road. When she saw Kayode's face lift from the dirt, something in her own face collapsed, like a wall that had been holding back a flood for 20 decades finally giving way. She pressed a trembling hand to her mouth and said nothing. But her eyes did not leave him. Her name was Iyalaje, and she alone in that crowd knew exactly who Kayode was. To understand why an old woman's silence mattered more than a beggar's beating, you have to go back. Not far back, only 20 years, though 20 years is a long time to carry a secret that could get you killed for speaking it. 20 years ago, Ife was ruled by a good king. His name was Oba Adeyemi, and though he had 2 wives, only one of them, Queen Yeside, had given him a living son. That son was Prince Adewale, born beneath a sky the elders said was marked by lightning without thunder, a sign the priests whispered that the boy would carry both blessing and danger in equal measure. Oba Adeyemi loved that boy the way a man loves the one thing that makes his kingdom mean something after he's gone. And that love, more than anything else, is what got the boy nearly killed. Because Oba Adeyemi had a chief Balogun, his most trusted war chief, a man named Fagbore, who had served the king faithfully for 30 years, fought 3 wars for him, buried 2 of his own sons in service of the throne, and asked for nothing in return except that his own son, born the same year as the prince, would someday sit close to power. Fagbore did not ask for the throne outright. He was not a fool, but he wanted his bloodline remembered, honored, placed above the ordinary chiefs who had bled less than he had. Oba Adeyemi refused him, gently but firmly. "The throne is not a debt I can repay with blood that isn't royal," the king told him. "Your son will be honored, Fagbore, but he will never be king." Fagbore smiled when the king said this. He bowed low, thanked the king for his honesty, and walked out of that throne room, already deciding that if the throne will not be given, it would be taken, quietly, patiently, over 20 years if it had to be. Now here is where the story stops being simple, because Fagure was not a stupid villain who swung a sword in the dark. He was patient the way a python is patient. He waited 11 years, rising higher in the king's council, marrying his son Kunle into the good graces of the court, teaching the boy manners so refined that visiting dignitaries mistook him for royalty already. And when King Obadeyemi fell ill with a fever that no herbalist could explain, a fever that came suspiciously soon after Fagure began overseeing the king's personal meals each night, nobody thought to ask why the king's favorite chief had suddenly taken such tender interest in what the king ate each night. The king died. Prince Adewale was only 9 years old. By tradition, a regent would rule until the boy came to age. And of course, the council, half of them men Fagure had bought with land, titles and fear, chose Fagure as regent. If the story ended there, it would already be a tragedy. But it does not end there, because Fagure was not content to merely rule in the boy's name for 9 years and then hand the crown back like an honest man. He wanted the crown to belong to his own son forever. And so, 3 months into his regency, on a night when the Hamatani wind howled loud enough to swallow screams, Fagure sent men to the young prince's chambers. They were supposed to kill him in his sleep and burn the room so it would look like a stray coal from a lamp had done the deed. But Queen Yeside, who had never trusted Fagure, not once, not even when he wept the loudest at her husband's funeral, had placed a woman she trusted completely inside the palace kitchens as a silent guardian. That woman was Iya Laje, who back then was not old at all, but a young widow with sharp instincts and a debt of loyalty to the queen who had saved her from starvation years before. Iya Laje heard the men moving before they reached the prince's door. She woke the boy, wrapped him in a servant's cloth, and carried him out through the servants' passage, even as smoke began to curl from behind them. She did not stop running until she reached the river bank 3 miles from the palace, and there, in the reeds, she made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She could not keep him. Fabure's men would search every noble house, every trusted servant's home, everywhere a queen's loyalist might hide a prince. So she did the one thing no one would think to check. She gave him the life of a beggar. She cut his fine clothes into rags with her own hands, rubbed dirt into his soft royal skin, and told the frightened 9-year-old boy the hardest words she would ever say to a child. From today, your name is Kayode. You do not know your father, you do not know your mother, you are nobody, and if you are nobody, they cannot find you to kill you.
He cried and asked when he could go home. She told him a lie to keep him alive. When it is safe, I will come for you. She believed it when she said it. She did not know it would take 20 years, and that by the time it happened, it would not be her choice at all. Meanwhile, in the palace, Fagbore told the kingdom a different story. The prince, he announced, with tears that fooled everyone who didn't know better, had died in a tragic fire, alongside 2 servants who tried to save him. The kingdom mourned. Queen Yeside was not permitted to speak, was quietly moved to a smaller residence far from court for her health, and effectively silenced, because who would believe a grieving mother's accusations against the regent who wept the loudest at the funeral? And Fagbore's own son, Kunle, still only 10 years old at the time, was gradually introduced to court as a distant cousin of royal blood, a lie built so slowly, so patiently, over years of forged lineage records and bribed elders, that by the time Kunle turned 20, almost no one in the kingdom questioned that he carried a legitimate claim to the throne. Kunle himself did not know the full truth. He believed, genuinely believed, that some distant royal ancestor connected his family to the crown. His father had never told him about the fire, about the real prince, about any of it. Fagbore was clever enough to know that a son who believes his own lie defends it more convincingly than one who is only pretending. So for 20 years, 2 boys grew up in the same kingdom, never meeting, never knowing how close their fates were tangled. One grew up in silk, learning statecraft and swordsmanship, believing himself destined for a throne he did not know was stolen. The other grew up in gutters and market corners, learning how to disappear, how to beg without meeting eyes, how to survive on rejected scraps, believing himself nobody, when in fact he was the only true blood the throne had ever recognized. And now, 20 years later, On the very day the palace prepared to crown the false Prince Conle as king, hunger walked the true prince right up to the gate he was born behind, and an old woman standing near a baobab tree was the only living person who understood exactly what that meant. If you are the kind of person who needs to know how this ends, and trust me, you do, make sure you are subscribed, because what happens next is the part of this story people talk about for years. Iyalaje did not approach Kayode that day. She could not. Fagburi's spies were everywhere during coronation week, and a sudden reunion between an old servant woman and a beaten beggar would raise questions neither of them could survive answering. So she watched the guards drag him away from the gate and toss him into the gutter outside the market, and she went home that night and did not sleep. Because for 20 years, she had told herself she made the right choice. And for 20 years, some small cruel voice in her had whispered that she had only made him suffer instead of die quickly. She decided, lying awake in the dark, that the time for silence was over. Whatever it cost her, she would not let this coronation happen without at least trying to set right what she had bent so badly to save a child's life. The next morning, she found Kayode where beggars always ended up, near the old well behind the cloth market, nursing bruises with well water and stale bread a sympathetic trader had tossed him. She approached slowly, the way you approach a wounded animal that has learned humans mean pain. "You don't know me," she said, "but I knew your mother." Kayode barely lifted his head. Beggars heard many strange things from strangers, prophecies, insults, pity dressed up as wisdom. He had learned to let it wash past him. "I don't have a mother," he said flatly. "I don't have anybody." "You had a mother," Iyalaje said, her voice shaking now, despite 20 years of practicing calm. "Her name was Yeside. She's still alive. And your father was king of this land before the man they will crown tomorrow ever set foot in that throne room." For a moment, Kayode thought this was a cruel joke, the kind hungry children in the market played on beggars for entertainment. But something in the old woman's eyes stopped the laugh in her throat. There was no mockery there, only grief, decades of it, pressed into the lines of her face. "Who are you," he asked slowly, "to know such a thing? I am the one who carried you out of a burning room when you were 9 years old. I am the one who cut your royal robes into rags with my own hands and told you to forget your name so that you would live. I am the one who has watched you beg in this market for 20 years, too afraid to speak, because speaking meant both of our deaths." Kayode's hands began to shake, not from hunger this time. "You are lying," he whispered, though something in his chest had already begun to believe her. Some memory buried so deep that it felt like a dream he refused to trust. A memory of soft cloth, of a woman's voice singing him to sleep in a room with carved wooden pillars, of smoke and running feet in the dark. "Look at your chest," Iyalaje said. "Beneath your collarbone, on the left side, a mark shaped like a leopard's paw. Every prince born of the Ife bloodline for 6 generations has carried the same mark. Your father had it. His father before him had it." With trembling fingers, Kayode pulled back the torn collar of his rags, and there, faint, beneath years of scars and grime, but unmistakable once you knew to look, was the mark. 4 small ridges of raised skin, curved like a paw pressed into wet clay. Kayode sat in the dust by the well and did not move for a long time. "Why now?" he finally asked, his voice barely audible. "Why tell me now, after 20 years of silence?" Iyalaje's answer was the truth, plain and heavy. "Because tomorrow they crown a man who has no right to that throne, and if I die tonight without telling you, this lie becomes permanent. I have carried this secret longer than I have carried almost anything else in my life. I am too old and too tired to carry it into my grave." But telling Kayode the truth was only the beginning of the danger, not the end of it, because word travels in a market faster than either of them realized, and one person overheard fragment of that conversation by the well, a young palace servant girl named Moriniki, who had been sent to fetch water, and paused out of simple curiosity when she heard the words prince and Yeside spoken in the same breath as a beggar's name. Morinike did not fully understand what she had heard, but she understood enough to know it was dangerous, and dangerous secrets in Ife had a way of becoming valuable currency if you knew who to sell it to. She was young, ambitious, tired of scrubbing palace floors for wages that barely fed her family, and she made a decision in that moment that would tighten the knot of this story far beyond what anyone expected. She went not to Fagbure directly. She wasn't foolish enough to walk straight into Chief's chambers with rumors, but she went to one of his stewards, a man known to reward useful gossip with small coins. She told him what she heard. The steward, understanding immediately how explosive this fragment of information was, did not waste time carrying it upward. Morenike did not sleep well that night. Long after she had handed the rumor to the steward and pocketed her coins, she lay awake on her mat, replaying the old woman's words in her head, and a strange discomfort settled over her that the coins couldn't quiet. She had grown up in the city hearing whispered stories about the fire that killed the young prince. Stories the older women in the market told in hushed voices when they thought children weren't listening. How strange it had always seemed that a fire hot enough to kill a boy left no bones the priests could properly bless. How strange that the grieving queen had been moved away so quickly and so quietly. She had never thought much of it before. Rumors were the currency of palace servants, traded and forgotten by morning. But this one sat differently in her chest, heavier, the way a stone sits differently in your shoe, depending on where it lands. By the time dawn's first gray crept through the cracks of her window, Morenike had made a second decision, one that would matter far more than the first. She rose before the rest of the household staff, slipped out through the servants' gate, and went looking for the old woman she had overheard by the well, not to sell another rumor this time, but because something in her would not let her rest until she understood what she had actually set in motion. She never found the Iyalaje that morning. By the time she reached the market, the old woman had already gone into hiding, and General Ojo's men were moving quietly through the streets. But Morenike's restless conscience would matter later, in ways she could not yet imagine, because a servant girl who begins to doubt the comfortable lies of a palace is rarely satisfied staying silent for long, and what she chose to do with that doubt would not end with a handful of coins. By nightfall, Chief Fagbure knew that somewhere in his city, an old woman was whispering that the dead prince was not dead at all. Here is where you should lean in a little closer, because everything Fagbure had built for 20 years now depended on how fast he could silence a rumor before it grew legs and started walking through the palace halls on its own. Fagbure was not a man who panicked. 20 years of patient scheming had taught him that panic kills plans faster than enemies do. He summoned his most loyal enforcer, a scarred former soldier named Salako, and gave him a single, quiet instruction. Find the old woman spreading these lies, and find the beggar she claims is royal blood, and make sure neither of them lives to see the coronation. But Fagbure made one mistake that night, the same mistake almost every man who has built his power on lies eventually makes. He underestimated how many people had been quietly waiting 20 years for a reason to turn against him. Because General Balogun Ojo, the aging commander of the palace guard, had served under the true king Oba Adeyemi long before Fagbure's rise, and though he had never quite voiced his suspicions aloud, he had never quite believed the story of that fire. Too convenient, he always thought privately. Too clean. A fire that killed a prince and 2 servants, but left no bodies clear enough to properly mourn? No burned bones brought before the priests for the customary rites? He had buried his doubts for 20 years out of fear and old age and the simple exhaustion of a man who no longer had the strength to fight a war he wasn't sure he could win. But when Salako, Fagbure's enforcer, came to the guard barracks that night, asking for 2 men to help him deal with a troublesome beggar and an old woman spreading dangerous lies, General Ojo's 20 years of buried suspicion finally cracked open. He did not confront Salako. He simply asked with practiced calm, "What beggar? What old woman? What lies?" And Salako, never imagining the aging general posed any threat, told him everything Fagbure had told him, that a beggar in the market was claiming royal blood, that an old palace servant named Iyalaje was behind the rumor,
and that both needed to disappear quietly before sunrise. General Ojo excused himself, walked calmly back to his private chambers, and once the door was shut, sat down heavily in the dark, his hands trembling for the first time in decades. 20 years of guilt he had buried under duty rose up all at once. If there was even the smallest chance that the prince he had failed to protect 20 years ago was alive tonight, he was not going to fail him a second time. He gathered 3 men he trusted absolutely, men whose fathers had served the old king Fagure had never fully bought, and together, under cover of darkness, they moved through the city faster than Salako's men, reaching Iyalaje's small mud house before Fagure's assassins arrived. She was packing a small bundle of belongings, preparing, with the instinct of a woman who had survived one royal purge already, to flee before daylight. When General Ojo appeared at her door, she nearly collapsed from fear, certain her death had finally come. Iyalaje made her choice the way she had made every difficult choice in her life, quickly and with her whole chest. She told General Ojo, "Iya, I am not here to harm you," Ojo said quickly before she could scream. "I served your king. I have waited 20 years for a reason to believe the fire was a lie. Tell me now, is it true? Is the boy alive?" And here, right here at the edge of dawn, with danger closing from both directions, is where the story turns fully. Because if the general's loyalty was real, it meant the beggar boy suddenly had something he had never had in 20 years of poverty, someone with power on his side. But if it was a trap, a final test set by Fagure to flush out the last hiding place of the truth, then Iyalaje's next words would be the ones that finally got both her and Kayode killed. If you've made it this far, you already know this story isn't going to move slow from here. So let's keep going, because the next part is where everything either falls apart or comes together, and I promise you it's worth staying for. Iyalaje told General Ojo everything. The fire that was no accident, the 7th cloth she'd wrapped a 9-year-old prince in, 20 years of silence bought with the boy's suffering as a beggar in the very city that once bowed to his father. General Ojo did not weep, though something in his old soldier's face broke quietly at the confirmation. "Where is he now?" he asked. "By the old well behind the cloth market," she said, "if Fagure's men have not already found him." They had not, but only by minutes. When General Ojo and his men reached the well, they found Kayode being dragged into an alley by 2 of Salako's soldiers, a knife already drawn, the beggar boy fighting for his life with nothing but bare hands against trained killers. Ojo's men arrived just in time, cutting down one soldier and forcing the other to flee into the dark, leaving Kayode bleeding but alive, gasping in the dirt for the second time in 2 days. "Who are you?" Kayode managed to ask, staring up at the armored general standing over him. "Someone who should have protected you 20 years ago and failed," Ojo said. "And tonight, I intend to make up for that failure if you let me." There was no time for long explanations. Dawn was less than 3 hours away, and with it, the coronation of a false king. Ojo made a decision that terrified even him. Instead of hiding Kayode away for another 20 years of quiet safety, he decided the truth had to be spoken in the one place it could never be buried again, the throne room itself, in front of the entire court, on the very morning Kunle was meant to be crowned. "If we hide you," Ojo told Kayode, as they moved through the shadows toward the palace, Iyalaje limping beside them, refusing to be left behind after 20 years of silence. "Fagbure will simply try again next month, next year, until he succeeds. The only way you survive this is if the whole kingdom knows the truth at once, before he can silence it." Kayode, still weak, still bleeding, still barely able to believe he was a prince and not a beggar, asked the only question that mattered to him in that moment. "And if they don't believe an old woman and a bleeding beggar over the word of a chief who has ruled this kingdom for 20 years? Iyalaje answered before Ojo could. "Queen Yeside is still alive. She has lived in quiet exile for 2 decades, but she is still alive, and no elder in this kingdom would dare call the king's own widow a liar to her face, not without proof stronger than her word. And I have proof. I kept it, all these years hidden beneath the floor of my house, the signet ring your father wore the night of the fire. I pulled it from the ashes before I ran, though I never understood why I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. There it was, the object that would either save 3 lives or end them by sunrise. They moved through the palace's servant passages, the same corridors Iyalaje had once carried a frightened 9-year-old through, and reached the outskirts of the throne room just as the first grey light of dawn touched the horizon. The court had already begun to gather, nobles in their finest cloths, priests preparing the ceremonial items, and at the center of it all, dressed in robes he believed were rightfully his, stood Kunle, 20 years old, handsome, confident, utterly unaware that everything he believed about his own identity was about to be shattered in front of the entire kingdom. Fagbure stood beside his son, beaming with the pride of a man who believed his 20-year plan had finally reached its conclusion. He had no idea that the beggar he'd ordered killed hours earlier was still breathing, standing 30 feet away, hidden behind a pillar, waiting for the exact moment his mother would walk in. Because that was the last piece of General Ojo's plan. Someone had gone in the deepest hour of the night to the small, quiet residence where Queen Yeside had lived in forgotten exile for 20 years and told her, gently but urgently, that her son might be alive and that if she wanted to see the truth revealed, she needed to come to the palace at dawn, one final time, as the mother of a king rather than a discarded widow. She arrived just as the priests began the opening chants of the coronation ceremony, dressed simply, her hair grey now, her spine straighter than it had been in years, despite 2 decades of quiet grief. She did not announce herself with shouting or spectacle. She simply walked, slowly, deliberately, down the center aisle of the throne room, and the entire court fell into uneasy silence at the sight of a woman they had all been told to forget. Fagbere's smile faltered for the first time in 20 years. Queen Yeside, he said carefully, forcing warmth into his voice. This is an unexpected honor, though I fear you have arrived on the wrong day for old grievances. Today, we crown a new king. Yes, Yeside said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent hall. Tell me, Fagure, whose son do you crown today? The question hung in the air like smoke that refuses to clear. My distant cousin, Fagure said smoothly, the lie so practiced it barely required thought. Blood of the royal line, as the elders have confirmed many times over these past few years. Then you will not object, Yeside said, if I ask the priest to examine him for the mark all true sons of this bloodline carry beneath the collarbone, the leopard's paw. My husband carried it, my son carried it. Surely, if Kunle is truly of royal blood, he carries it too. The silence that followed was the kind that makes grown men's hearts stop. Fagbere's mind raced because he knew with absolute certainty that his son carried no such mark, because his son was not, had never been of royal blood at all. 20 years of careful forgery, bribed elders, and rewritten lineage records had built a lie strong enough to fool an entire court, but it could not fool a birthmark that either existed or didn't. This is beneath the dignity of a coronation, Fagure said quickly, too quickly, his composure cracking at the edges. The queen's grief has clearly disturbed her mind. Guards, escort her. Let her speak, General Ojo's voice boomed from the back of the hall, and every head turned as he stepped forward, flanked by armed men loyal to him only. Let the queen finish, Fagure, unless you have something to fear from a simple question. Fagure understood, in that single terrible moment, that his general, his own palace guard, had turned against him. The foundation of 20 years of lies trembled beneath his feet. And then Iyalaje stepped out from behind the pillar, no longer hidden, an old woman standing tall despite trembling knees, holding a small object wrapped in cloth that she had kept safe for 20 years. Chief Fagbore knows exactly why the mark matters, she said, her voice cutting through the stunned silence of the court. Because 20 years ago, on the night the true prince was supposedly killed in a fire, I carried that same prince alive out of the flames and hid him as a beggar in this very city to save his life from the man who ordered his death. Gasps rippled through the court like wind through tall grass. Lies, Fagbore snarled, all pretense of calm finally abandoned. The desperate lies of a mad old woman trying to disrupt a lawful coronation. Then you will not object, Iyalaje said, to him showing his own chest as proof of his innocence, before I show you the mark of the boy I saved. She turned toward the pillar and called softly into the shadows, come forward, it's time. And Kayode stepped into the throne room of Ife for the first time in 20 years, bruised, bleeding, dressed in rags, but walking with a straightened spine because for the first time in his life, he understood exactly who he was. The court did not laugh at him this time. The court fell utterly silent because every eye present could see, even beneath dirt and dried blood, an unmistakable resemblance to the portraits of the old king that still hung, half forgotten, in the palace's outer halls. He pulled back his torn collar without being asked, revealing the leopard's paw birthmark beneath his collarbone, and Queen Yeside, who had spent 20 years believing her son had burnt to death in front of her, let out a sound that was not quite a scream and not quite a sob, but something older and deeper than either, the sound of 2 decades of grief finally breaking apart in a single instant. She crossed the hall faster than her aged legs should have allowed, and gathered her son into her arms in front of the entire court. And for a long moment, no one in that throne room spoke, because everyone present understood they were witnessing something no lie, however carefully built, could survive. Fagbure understood it too, and in the chaos of that moment, he reached for the ceremonial dagger at his side, the one meant for the coronation ritual, and lunged not at Kayode, but at Queen Yeside herself, screaming that if the truth could not be buried, then the last living proof of the old bloodline's grief would die with his secret. General Ojo was faster. He stepped between the chief and the queen just as Fagbure's blade came down, taking the wound meant for her across his own forearm, and in the same motion, his soldier seized Fagbure before he could strike again, wresting the dagger from his grip as the man who had ruled Ife in shadows for 20 years finally screamed the truth aloud himself in the madness of his final unraveling, admitting in front of every noble and priest in the hall exactly what he had done to seize a throne that was never his. Kunle, who had believed his entire life that he was born to rule, stood frozen at the center of the hall, watching his father confess to murder, betrayal, and 20 years of fabricated bloodlines, understanding in the space of a single unbearable moment that everything he had ever believed about himself was built on his father's lies. He did not resist when the guards moved to restrain him too, though everyone in that hall, even Kayode, could see that the young man was not a villain, only a son who had inherited a crime he never knew he was committing. That is not where this story ends easily though, because nothing this heavy resolves without cost. Fagbure was stripped of his title and imprisoned to await judgment before the Council of Elders, his 20 years of quiet power collapsing into disgrace in a single morning. Kunle, though innocent of his father's original crimes, could not remain in a court that no longer trusted the very bloodline he'd been raised to believe in. He was exiled, not executed, sent from the only life he had ever known to build something new far from Ife's throne, carrying the weight of a father's sins he never chose. And Kayode? No, Prince Adewale, restored now to the name Iyalaje had stripped him from 20 years ago to save his life, was crowned not that same morning, but 3 weeks later, once the court had properly mourned what was lost and properly celebrated what was found. He insisted, against the protests of several elders, that Iyalaje sit beside the throne during the ceremony, not as a servant, but as the woman who had given up her own peace for 20 decades to keep a 9-year-old boy alive, long enough to become a king. She wept through the entire coronation, not from joy alone, but from the release of 20 years of guilt she had carried for turning a prince into a beggar to save his life, a burden she finally set down. General Ojo recovered from his wound slowly and was named the new king's most trusted advisor, the one man in the palace who had chosen loyalty to a memory over safety in a lie. And Morenike, the seventh girl whose loose tongue had nearly gotten a beggar and an old woman killed, came forward on her own 3 days after the coronation and confessed everything to General Ojo before anyone else could accuse her. She did not have to. No one had traced the leak back to her, and she could easily have stayed silent and safe. But the same restlessness that had sent her out at dawn looking for Iyalaje would not let her enjoy a throne room's peace built partly on her own carelessness. King Adewale listened to her confession in silence, and when she finished, trembling, waiting for punishment, he asked her only one question. Why tell me now when you could have said nothing? Because I have spent my whole life watching this palace bury truths that were inconvenient, and I did not want to become one more person who let a lie live because speaking was dangerous. He did not punish her. He made her a steward of the royal household, the youngest in the kingdom's memory, because a king who had spent 20 years buried by other people's silence understood better than anyone the rare value of someone willing to break it, even imperfectly, even too late to undo the damage her first choice had nearly caused. But Adewale, for all the joy of his restoration, was not the same boy who had been carried out of a burning room 20 years ago. 20 years of hunger, 20 years of being spat on and beaten and dismissed as nobody had carved something into him that no throne could smooth over. He ruled in the years that followed as a king who never forgot what it felt like to be thrown into the dust outside his own gate, a king who fed beggars at his palace door with his own hands because he remembered always exactly what it meant to be one. And sometimes, late at night, long after the court had gone to sleep, he would sit by the old well behind the cloth market, alone, in simple cloth instead of royal robes, and remember the 9-year-old boy who once believed he had no name at all, because some truths once carried that deep never fully let go of the person who survived them. Word reached him years later of Kunle, the young man who had once stood where Adewale now stood, dressed in robes meant for a coronation that would never come. Kunle had traveled far from Ife, past the borders of every kingdom that had ever heard whispers of his father's disgrace, and built a quiet life for himself as a trader in a distant town where no one knew his name or his father's crimes. He never sent word back to Ife, and Adewale never sent for him, because both men understood, without needing to say it aloud, that whatever peace existed between them could only survive at a distance. Adewale did not hate him. He had tried in the early days to feel something sharper than pity for the boy who had unknowingly worn his life like borrowed clothes, but hatred never quite settled in him the way he expected it to. Some mornings he wondered whether Kunle woke in his distant town and felt the same phantom weight, the shape of a crown that never truly belonged to him, pressing down on a head that did nothing wrong except believe what he was raised to believe. Queen Yeside lived long enough to see her son crowned, long enough to hold her children in her arms before her own strength finally gave out. And on the day she died, the entire kingdom mourned properly for the first time in 20 years. Not a hurried, suspicious mourning built on lies about a fire, but a full, unhurried grief for a woman who had waited 20 decades to see justice arrive and had not wasted a single day of the time she was given once it finally did. Iyalaje remained in the palace until her final years, refusing any offer of a grander house, a quieter life away from the noise of court. She told the king once, near the end, that she had spent so many years hiding in plain sight that a quiet retirement would have felt like disappearing all over again, and she was done disappearing. When she died, Adewale insisted she be buried among the royal family's own ancestors, an honor no servant had ever received in the kingdom's history, and no elder dared object, because everyone in that court understood by then exactly what she had given up to keep a 9-year-old prince alive long enough to become a king. That is the story of the beggar who was never truly a beggar at all, a prince stolen by ambition, saved by love, and restored by truth that refused to be buried, no matter how many years passed or how many people tried to bury it deeper. If this story held you the way I hope it did, don't let it end here. Subscribe because there are more stories like this one waiting. Stories about the secrets our families bury, the truths that refuse to stay dead, and the ordinary people who choose, against every fear, to finally speak them aloud. I'll see you in the next one.